Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're so excited to have this opportunity to help Alyssa Palombo launch her new book. This is Alyssa's third visit here at the book, which has grown immensely since she first came. Yeah. An opportunity to launch her book. So we do have a book club here for those of you who don't know. Here at the Birchfield Penny Arts Center, and we meet the first Thursday of every month. But every now and again, we have the privilege, like we have this evening, to help launch a new book. And so that's what we're doing this evening. I'm not going to talk very long. I'm going to turn it over to my friend Laura Glista, who has graciously agreed to facilitate for us this evening. And Alyssa has the distinct honor of introducing the author. So, Laura?
I'm happy to do that. She's the author of 4 previous historical novels, as well as a contemporary novel called Heavy Metal Symphony under the name A.K. Palombo. She graduated from Canisius College with degrees in English and creative writing, respectively. For her new released novel from Crooked Lane Books, it's a historical thriller, The Assassin of Venice, which Booklist called a tense, sexy work of historical fiction and political intrigue in its starred review. So it's very nice to welcome you to Birchfield.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Mary, Laura, the team here at Birchfield Penny for having me. Thank you to John Welch and Talking Leaves Books for being here selling copies of the book. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do tonight is I have a PowerPoint here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history behind the book. So actually, if you could go to the next slide. This is, a synopsis of the book. But basically, if you're not familiar, the story is that the main character, Valentina Riccardi, is one of Venice's famed courtesans. And she also moonlights as an assassin for the Venetian Council of 10. And things sort of come to a head when her contact on the Council of 10 tells her that she has to kill the one man that she loves. So that's the basic story. This book, the characters, the plot are all fictional, but it's based on very real history. So there's kind of 2 pillars of history that underpin the book. And the first is the Venetian government, its structure, and the Council of 10. And the second is the real history of Venice's famous courtesans. So as such, I've divided the presentation into 2 sections. So my thinking is that I will make you sit through all the government and politics stuff first, and then your reward will be the sexy history of the courtesans. So that's what we're going to do. So we will start. If you go to the next. Yep, there we go. So the Republic of Venice is where our book takes place in the mid 1500s. So if anyone has seen, I have a presentation I give about my novel, The Borgia Confessions. So if you've seen that presentation, you're familiar with this slide. But when we talk about Renaissance Italy, there was no such place as Italy, right? It was all of these different countries. It was not a unified country until 1865, thereabouts, I want to say. So, of course, relevant to our interests tonight is the Venetian Republic, which, as you can see, is much bigger than just the city of Venice. It encompasses much of what is now the region of the Veneto, surrounding regions, the coast of Croatia. That was all part of Venice. And you see that, Milan was its own country. That was a duchy. The Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, which were ruled by the Pope as he was the secular leader of the Papal States, as well as obviously the religious head of the Catholic Church. Florence was a republic, kind of. We won't get into that. Genoa was a republic. So, some of these other kingdoms were or city-states really, were run by dukes, princelings, lords, etc. So these were all different countries. They all had competing interests. They shared a language, obviously, with some regional differences. But the thing that's important to remember is that this was not a unified place. These were all separate countries with their own interests. So that plays into the book a little bit, just when we're thinking about the political landscape of the Italian peninsula, specifically during this time period. Okay, so the Venetian government. It was a beast. It was a very big government. It was complicated. It was literally very Byzantine. it was set up that way on purpose to discourage corruption, any one person becoming too powerful. That's really important to keep in mind. They designed it to be as complicated as possible. So I'm going to give you a basic overview. There's more councils and offices and all kinds of things, but this is kind of the main structure that you need to keep in mind. So very basically, what the Venetian government was composed of, at the bottom you had the Great Council. This was the largest body of the government. Every male member of a set group of patrician families was eligible for a seat in the Great Council when he turned 25. These families were set kind of in stone around, I want to say the 1100s. I could be wrong about that, but early on, well before this book takes place. So the Great Council at any given time had between like 1,100 and 2,000 members. So the serious legislative business of the government didn't happen there. It's just too many people. It's just too much going on. So what the Great Council mostly did was they elected the rest of the folks that you see here, and from among their number. And then they also were responsible for certain political appointments, other political posts around the city. So the Senate was where, in fact, most of the serious legislative business of the government happened. I want to say there were, oh gosh, now I'm drawing a blank. I want to say there were like 400 senators or so. So that's a much more manageable, size of group of people to deal with. The Quarantia and the Council of 40 was another, there were 40 people, shocking. They dealt with both the financial arm of the government and the judiciary for some reason. They were responsible for both of those. The Council of 10, which is kind of mostly our concern this evening, there were, now I tricked you with the Council of 40. There were 13 people on the Council of 10 because God forbid, the names of things make sense. But the 10 were, I like to describe them to Americans as like the FBI, the CIA, and Homeland Security all rolled into one. I think that kind of gives you a picture. We'll talk more about them on the next slide. But there were 10 elected members, and then the other three one was the Doge, and then two of the Doge's counselors. So that's why you had 13. The minor council were a smaller group who were advisors to the Doge. And then the Doge was the figurehead of the government. He was elected by the Great Council in this absolutely ridiculous election process where they started by electing, I think, 40 electors or 30 electors. And then those electors elected more electors, and those electors elected up. Like, it literally went on for like 10 rounds of elections until they got to the final group that actually would elect the Doge. And the reason it was set up that way was to prevent any kind of rigging of the election, any corruption, because there were so many layers that you couldn't possibly like fix it. It was just, there was too much going on. So the Doge, again, he's kind of the figurehead of the government. He didn't have a ton of power. The Senate mostly did the important things. The Doge could, of course, influence political matters that were happening. But he was, his word wasn't law. He wasn't a king. He wasn't anything of the sort. He actually couldn't even leave Venice without the permission of the Great Council. So he, again, was more of a figurehead than anything else. Very important to the Venetians, and this plays a part in the book, was term limits. They loved term limits. Your seat on the Great Council was for life if you were a member of one of those families and you were a man. And the Doge was elected for life. Everybody else, no. So the Senate was, each term was a year. You could then be reelected if you so chose. Council of 40 was also a year, but you could not serve. You could serve again, but not another term in a row. Oh no, I'm sorry. One of them, the minor council, one of them you could serve consecutive terms and one you couldn't. I have notes in the PowerPoint and now I'm mixing it up. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The minor council was your term was 8 months. And then yes, I think that one you could not serve again, like the next term in a row. You had to wait if you wanted to be elected to it again. And then the Council of 10, you could serve for 1 year and then never again. This was to prevent any one man or family from becoming too powerful. The Venetians hated nothing so much as cults of personality in their politics, which after the last decade or so of American politics, I think we're right. So that's why this was set up as such. They were very strict about, who has what kind of power and for how long. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the Council of 10, which is, again, kind of the most important to the book. And then the picture in the background is actually the Chamber of the 10 in the Doge's Palace, which is where they would meet and get together. Sorry. So we talked about it was actually 13 members. It was headed by the Tre Capi, or the three heads. And how that worked was the Council of 10 would elect those three leaders. They would serve as leaders of the 10 for a month at a time. And during that month, those three men could not leave the Doge's palace at all, because the fear was that they could become corrupted by some kind of outside influence. So that rotated through the council. As I alluded to before, they were responsible for gathering intelligence, espionage, interrogations, assassinations, all of that stuff. One of their primary functions was to uncover treason or plots against the Venetian Republic. Again, with the political situation, on the Italian peninsula at the time, there was a lot of jockeying for power. Venice was actually the most powerful country, actually in Europe, for a very long time. By the time this book takes place, the 1530s, their influence was starting to wane a little bit. They had risen to power and became very, very wealthy and powerful because they were sort of the gateway of the Eastern trade that came in, through the Mediterranean, through Constantinople, and then it reached further east. So obviously, of course, by the 1500s, the mercantile interests of most in Europe had shifted from the east to the colonization of North America. So in the 1500s, Venice was starting to lose its power and influence. They didn't quite know it yet. But as the years passed, they kind of faded as the focus of trade and whatnot shifted. The Ottoman Empire was their big rival. Spain likes to try and meddle a lot in the affairs of the Italian peninsula at large. France as well. Spain was kind of the biggest one. And then, the Venetians there were several wars fought between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. That didn't stop them from trading with the Ottoman Empire. They were actually their biggest trading partner. Venetians love to make money. So there was no reason why, they were enemies in other ways. There was no reason why they trade during other times. It drove the Pope crazy, in case anyone was wondering. But, and then this was a really interesting fact that I found when researching this book, that there's a mention of it, but I couldn't really do anything more with it. But there was an entire department of code breakers and code makers in the Doge's palace. And their job was to break the codes of enemy nations that were intercepted, and then to develop new codes for Venetian assets abroad so that they could communicate back with the Council of 10. And so, if those codes got broken, they had to come up with new ones, that hadn't been intercepted. So I thought that was really fascinating. And they did engage in torture to gather information. There was a room specifically in the bowels of the Doge's prison where they used what's called a strappado, which was kind of their favored method of torture. And it involved, so it was a rope looped through a pulley on the ceiling, and they would tie the person's hand behind their back, tie the rope to their wrists, and lift them up. So you can imagine that was not fun. And then they could raise them up and lower them. So that was a little more. All right. Okay. So this slide, fun fact, In the Mouth of the Lion was actually the original title of this book. I still like it as a title, but I understand that it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the book. So I kept it as the title for this slide. But so the lion's mouth, the bocca di leone, or bocche dei leoni is the plural. These were essentially mailboxes all around Venice. And what they were for was you could write a letter denouncing someone if you knew they were guilty of something and put them in one of these mailboxes, and the Council of 10 would look into it. And they got their name because most of them are carved in the shape of a lion's head, because the winged lion is the symbol of Saint Mark, who's the patron saint of Venice. This is the one in the courtyard of the Doge's palace. So he's not a lion. He's this guy with very aggressive eyebrows. But that's what they were called.
Very aggressive.
Yeah, so there were several around the city. As I said, they served as mailboxes. You could denounce people. If you were denouncing a private citizen, you had to sign your name to it, or they would disregard it. And so that was obviously to sort of, discourage things like, well, my neighbor's getting on my nerves, I'm going to to the Council of 10. If you were denouncing a public official, it could be anonymous. I have read, though, that they tended to take most anonymous accusations not as seriously. So for what that's worth. Okay, you made it. You made it to the sexy history portion. All right, so the next section, there'll be some paintings of naked ladies. We're all adults here, so
We're in a museum.
as a heads up, we're in an art museum. It's art.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, sex work in the Venetian Republic. So sex work in Venice was legal for women. Therefore, these ladies paid their taxes. They were, sex workers were a big source of tax revenue for the Venetian government. There was, of course, an underground male sex trade. Male sex workers often dressed as women. And so in policing these laws, what the authorities would do is that there were different classes of sex workers, which we'll talk about in a second. But what they would do when sort of enforcing these laws was they would sometimes ask the women to expose one of their breasts to prove that she was a woman and not a man dressed as a woman. The courtesans were a bit of a higher class, so they would usually be asked to show their leg instead, on the assumption that you couldn't, if it was a man's leg, you would be able to tell the difference. And so some of the sex workers who worked on the street started actually wearing bodices cut below their breasts to just avoid harassment by the authorities. Like, okay, here we go. You don't have to ask to see it, it's here. 1 in 4 women in Venice was a sex worker during the Renaissance, which seems like a high number, but also remember, Venice was a major, major port city. Port cities technically, historically had usually the biggest sex trade because you had folks from all over the world coming in and out. So there were 2 categories for the most part of sex workers in Venice. The courtesana oneste, which were the courtesans, that translates to honest courtesan, and the cortigiana di lume, or she was more commonly known as the meretrice. Those would be streetwalkers, I guess, for lack of a better term. And the streetwalkers, a lot of them hung out on a place called the Ponte delle Tette, which means, and this is true, the Bridge of Tits. I'm not making that up. That's the kind of thing you can't make up and put in a book because no one will believe it. That was really what it was called. Okay, so the courtesane oneste, or the honest courtesan, is what Valentina is in the book. So these women were highly educated. They were well read. They often spoke multiple languages. They could discuss literature, politics, current events, philosophy. Oftentimes they were musically proficient. They could sing, play an instrument. They provided more than just sex to their clients. So it certainly that was part of the arrangement. But it was the intellectual companionship, the entertainment. They could, if you were hosting a salon, they could entertain your guests. It wasn't purely sex as transaction. It was sort of this whole experience, I guess you could say. So they attended and held parties, salons, there would be poetry exchanged and things like that, like intellectual discussions held. They served specifically the patrician men of Venice, as well as sometimes wealthy tourists, especially later on in the Venetian Republic, like into the 18th century, when you had young noblemen, like from England, for instance, going on the Grand Tour. Venice was a must visit location because of the courtesans. It was this whole experience that these young men all felt they had to have. They were often very wealthy in their own right. So to give you an example, one dress that a courtesan might own at this time during the Renaissance cost around $400,000 in today's money. So now, granted, of course, clothes back then were all handmade. They might have had like pearls sewn on them and things like that. But these women had some money. They very much did. Oh, and actually, on that note, I meant to put a bullet point for this and I forgot. But because they were so wealthy and often so well dressed, Legally, when they went into public, they had to distinguish themselves from women of the patrician class. And so they were required to wear something yellow. So that could be like a scarf, a sash, a feather, yellow feather in their hair, something of that nature, which I thought was really interesting because we kind of always associate the color red with like sex workers, like scarlet women, but they had to wear something yellow. Obviously, being a courtesan was not all, glamorous times. There were dangers to it. Obviously, sexually transmitted disease, pregnancy, whether unwanted or wanted, was dangerous for women. It still is. It was much more so back then. Methods of birth control and abortion were available, but they were not as safe or effective as what's available today. So that was dicey. Of course, physical and sexual assault. Sometimes jealous lovers would, like slash a woman's face to mar her beauty, things like that. And accusations of witchcraft was a thing. So when times of trouble would descend on Venice, whether war or outbreaks of the plague, people sort of saw it as a sign of God's disfavor. And so they would look around for someone to blame. And so sex workers make a good scapegoat, and courtesans were the most visible. So there were instances of courtesans being accused of witchcraft.
Was witchcraft illegal?
Yeah. It was technically illegal for religious reasons, basically because of the Catholic Church. Sorry, can you go back?
When you said that they were wealthy in their own right, were they wealthy from their family or just from their job?
So a little bit of both, mostly from their job, because they were well educated. You had to have money in the first place to set yourself up as a courtesan. So they were mostly from like upper middle class families. So they had the means to get an education. And so they had enough money to kind of get started. But then again, they were serving the richest men in Venice, who were some of the richest men in Europe at the time. So they made a lot of money, through their profession as well. And then just this painting, you might recognize, this is Titian's Venus of Urbino. The woman in the painting was real. She's a Venetian courtesan. Her name was Angela del Moro. And Titian actually often used Venetian courtesans to model for his work. So that's why I chose that one. Okay, thank you. All right. So you might be wondering why? Like, why was this whole system of courtesans, why did this exist other than the obvious reason? So there were courtesans, of course, in other parts of Europe, but in Venice, the reasons for kind of this social structure were that one of them being that among the Venetian patrician classes, it was not considered appropriate for a good woman to be educated. Venice was pretty insular in that as a country, they were so powerful, they didn't need to make marriage alliances with like foreign countries. So the Venetian patrician class married each other, essentially. So the women of the Venetian patrician class were raised basically to not think about things. Most of them couldn't read. They couldn't do basic mathematics. And then they married these highly educated men who were brought up to run the Republic. So go to the next. Yep. So you have these highly educated men married to women who can barely string a sentence together through no fault of their own, of course. Like, this is just unfortunately the social construct they were living under. So these men were genuinely looking for conversation, intellectual companionship, culture, things of that nature. Something else that played a part in this was that sometimes the younger sons of these patrician families were not permitted to marry and have children, because then you'd break up the family fortune and there would be less to go around. So sometimes only the eldest son could get married. He would pass it on to his eldest son, and the younger sons kind of just did whatever they wanted. So then, of course, they're looking for not only sex, but conversation, entertainment, female companionship. So that was also a big part of the courtesan's trade as well. And then this is another Titian painting. This is also pretty famous. This is Venus with a mirror. This is one of my favorites. That's really the only reason it's here. but the woman who modeled was probably a Venetian courtesan as well. I think there's one more. Yes. So I figured I would end with a quote from an actual Venetian courtesan, Veronica Franco. She was a published poet in her own right. She was an early feminist thinker. She advocated for the rights of women. So you can kind of read her words there, but this is a portrait of her. She published her own poetry, which again was something that a good woman couldn't do, but because she was a courtesan, she had the freedom to do that. And another interesting fact about her was that the King of France, Henri, I forget what his Roman numeral was, like Henri V or something, but he came to Venice and the Venetians were hoping to make an alliance with him. And so they sent him Veronica to entertain him. And it must have gone pretty well because then he signed up for the alliance. So literally courtesans wielded more power sometimes than, you might expect. She actually, she influenced international politics basically by going in and entertaining the King of France. So that was sort of another interesting role that they played or had the potential to play. And that is my presentation. These are all my books. Of course, The Assassin of Venice is the newest one. So if you were interested in what you heard here tonight, there is more where that came from in the book, as well as what I think hopefully is an interesting story. So I hope you will check it out.
Thank you.
Are your books connected in any way to the stories kind?
No, they're all
separate.
They're all standalones. Yeah.
Alyssa,
Yeah.
where did these women are very interesting. Where did they come from and how did they get educated like this? I mean, it seems like a real separation. Did the noble families, females spring to this, or were they restricted to being wives?
So yeah, the women of the patrician classes really were expected to marry and bear children. That was pretty much it. As I said, most of the courtesans came from sort of middle classes, so they might have had enough money to be educated, or they had the opportunity to be educated. How the profession sort of kept going in a lot of cases was that mothers would groom their daughters to become courtesans. So if a woman who was a courtesan had a daughter, she would teach her the family business, essentially.
She's a momager.
A lot. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of that too. And that was kind of how it kept going. But actually, so Veronica Franco, who I mentioned, she was from a middle-class family. She was married and then her husband died and she kind of fell on hard times. And because she had had an education, I think her mother may have worked as a courtesan for a period of time. That's how she kind of went into the trade too, was that, she was widowed. She had to support herself. And so that was what she did. Yes.
Is there any similarity between them and like a Japanese geishas?
I think so. I'm not that well versed in the geishas and that, but I understand it's kind of a similar thing, was that they were also, they provided like entertainment and culture and that sort of thing as well. Yeah.
How long did this system last?
Oh, basically until the fall of the Republic, which was 1797. Napoleon, when Napoleon ended the Venetian Republic. But yeah, essentially, since Venice was established as a city, there were sex workers again, because it was a port city. The courtesan system kind of built up over time. And by the Renaissance, it was, in its heyday. And then that continued, until the fall of the Republic. Yes.
The book is written in the first person, right?
Yes.
And I just wonder how you sort of wrote yourself into the voice of this particular courtesan and got that right.
Yeah, that's interesting because of all my characters, Valentina is probably the most different from me. And I think that's actually what made her so much fun to write, was that I kind of got to explore this completely other world, this other person. And she was also one of those characters who just right from the get-go, her voice was very vivid in my head. And sometimes that happens and sometimes I have to work at it more. It just depends. But certainly, I've written about the Renaissance before, I've written about Venice before. So having a lot of knowledge already of the time period and the place and sort of the culture, I think helped inform her a little bit too. But yeah, she was kind of, as soon as I sat down, she was sort of off to the races. Like she was just one of those who she was ready to tell me her story. And it kind of just went from there. But I will say too, like there is something, I always have to find something in common with all my main characters, I think, to be able to write them. And so for Valentina, she's very loyal to her family and friends and very protective of them. So I think that's the thing that we share. So that was sort of my initial way in.
So do you want to share a little about the time when you started this or your inspiration for this book?
Sure. So I actually started writing this, it was December of 2019. And there were kind of three big pieces of inspiration. But also part of it came from the fact that in the Borgia Confessions, I had written from the point of view of Cesare Borgia, that book is kind of his villain origin story. And so I thought it would be fun to kind of write another villain character. I don't think Valentina is a villain. I think she is a little bit, she's morally flexible. We'll put it that way. So that was part of it. And actually, that's why her name is Valentina, because Cesare Borgia was known as Duke Valentino. So that her name is actually a little nod to him. But there were kind of three main pieces of inspiration that had been kind of kicking around in my head for a while. One was the song What Have You Done by Within Temptation. And it's about these two lovers who are kind of trying to kill each other. And I always wanted to write something about that. One was the character of Arya Stark in Game of Thrones. So if you're familiar with her, if you're a fan, then this is the book for you. And then the last thing, kind of the last piece was last time I was in Venice with my brother in 2018, we went to this wild exhibit about crime and punishment in the Venetian state. And it was weird. We went kind of like late at night. We were like the only people there. It was kind of creepy. That the Strapato I mentioned, they had this room where you walk in and it was like hanging from the ceiling, and that was all that was in the room. And there was this like sound effects playing of like this rope creaking. And again, there's like nobody else in this place. It was so creepy. And they had like, there was like on the one floor, I think there was, the rack. It's like, oh, this is from, 15th century Spain. I'm like, wait, so was this a thing that they used? Because that's extremely cursed. Like, I'm sure that this object is haunted. So there was a lot of things in there that kind of got the wheels turning. Yes.
So you said Arya Stark is kind of an influence. I was wondering how that could be when she's so like anti everything feminine, and courtesans kind of seem like everything feminine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I think so. Arya was a little bit of the inspiration in terms of just being a badass, I guess, for lack of a better word. And being Valentina also, there's some flashback scenes where you see her life before she became a courtesan. And so there's a little bit of Arya in there too. But I mean, I think certainly we know now that a strong female character, doesn't have to have a sword and doesn't have to kick butt and everything like that. You can be emotionally strong. You can be mentally strong. There's lots of ways to be a strong woman and a strong female character. With that said, I do think there's something really satisfying about a woman who is in no physical danger from the world around her. So that was a little bit of what went into Valentina as well.
I see.
So as a writer, I was always curious in the art realm, like, do you have a place that you like to write or a certain time of day? Are you very regimented about it, or as it strikes you to write? Yeah, I mean, so regimented in the sense that I have to be very disciplined, but not in the sense that I have to write when I have time. So I work a full-time job, as many of you know. So I usually do write like right after work, like kind of before dinner, like I sit down at my desk is usually where I end up writing. And I usually will set like a word count goal for myself. So today I want to write 1,000 words. And like, as soon as I write my 1,000 words, then I'm done for the day. Sometimes getting to 1,000 words is like pulling teeth. Sometimes I get to 2,000 because I'm just like in the zone and I'm not even thinking about it and I just go with it. And then, certainly on the weekends as well, when I feel like I need a change of scenery, I'll go to a coffee shop or something like that. Like actually a revision I was recently working on was like, it was going very slowly. So one Saturday I parked myself in a coffee shop for a couple hours and I'm like, okay, new view. Let's see where we get. And it did help.
You have other things in the pipeline?
There's a few things in the works. So the revision I just mentioned, I finished. That's with my agent right now. I actually have started another historical thriller set in Venice. This one is based on a real historical thing that happened that I've always wanted to write about. So we will see if my publisher picks that up. The more copies you all buy, the more likely they will be to do that. And then I spent a lot of last year working on a book that I hope is going to be my debut fantasy novel. So please keep your fingers crossed, light a candle for me in that book because I love it very much. So yeah, a few different things kind of in the works. So we'll see which one actually ends up being the next published book.
Have you been to Italy before?
Yes, several times. So I've been to Venice, I think 3 times now, and I had originally wanted to go again to do some specific, like, targeted research for this book. But if you remember, I said I started writing it in December of 2019. So I think you all know why I didn't go to Italy that year. But having been to Venice before was definitely really helpful, just in terms of the first book, my debut novel, The Violinist of Venice. I started writing it before I had been there. And I was like, logistically, how do you get around in this place? Like, that was one of the things I really needed to see. So that helps. And the nice thing about Venice is it has not changed all that much in several hundred years. Like, they're not paving new roads really, or like putting up new buildings. There's I think only 3 or 4 modern buildings in Venice. So a lot of it does look quite a bit like it did, hundreds of years ago. So.
I like when you've added some music connections because you've also got that in your background.
Yes. Yeah. So this book doesn't really have that, but some of my other ones do for sure. Because music is my other great love in life. So, as you can probably tell from me. Any other questions? Are there any from?
Yeah, anyone who's on Zoom, if you have questions for Alyssa, just unmute yourself and you can ask. Or you can use the chat too, if you don't want to talk.
Well, I've read 3 books and I've enjoyed the 3 of them. They're wonderful. In fact, I stayed up late waiting for the release so I could download my Audible.
Oh,
I've been
nice.
listening to
this one?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Just 2 days ago, right?
Yes. Yeah. So this just came out Tuesday. And yes, the audiobook, I'm listening to it right now, is amazing. The narrator, Nicole Zanzarella, she's perfect. Like, she is exactly how Valentina sounded in my head. So if you enjoy audio, I would definitely recommend the audio of this. Yeah.
Do you get to hear that ahead of time to kind of audition a reader?
Yeah, so I actually do, they'll send me some narrator choices. And so for this book, they sent me 3 different narrators, and Nicole had actually done the audiobook for The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence as well. So as soon as I saw her name on the list, I was like, oh no, we need Nicole back. The other 2 were great too, but yeah, she was perfect. And then actually my debut novel, The Violinist of Venice, just came out in audio for the first time as well. So again, if you're interested in audiobooks, that one's out there now finally.
Could you give a little synopsis of your previous books for those?
Sure. Yeah. So
Do you want me to pull that slide?
yeah, actually that would be great. Okay. Yeah. So The Violinist of Venice was my debut. That is about a young woman who has an affair with Antonio Vivaldi, the composer, and it follows her life, into her later years. The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence is about Simonetta Vespucci, who is a real historical figure. She is the woman in Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. So that book is about her and her relationship with him. The Spell Book of Katrina Van Tassel fun fact, that is my best-selling book by far, so far. That's a retelling of the legend of Sleepy Hollow from Katrina's point of view. And it also kind of continues the story after Irving ended it. So we find out what happened to Ichabod Crane. The Borgia Confessions is told by 2 narrators. One is Cesare Borgia, and one is a fictional character named Madeline Moretti, who's a servant who works for the family, and how they get involved with each other and all these crazy things that go on. Heavy Metal Symphony is a book that I love very deeply. I actually self-published this one last year. It's a contemporary novel. It's set in Buffalo, and it's about a woman who joins her boyfriend's metal band as the lead singer, and it's told in 2 timelines. And in the sort of present day timeline, the band is in the studio recording their new album. Things between Ava and Killian are falling apart. And then it alternates with chapters set in the past where you see how they met and how their relationship progressed to sort of get them to that point. And I wrote lots of song lyrics and things for that book. So that's a fun one if you like music. And like I said, it's set in Buffalo. And then, yes, and then The Assassin of Venice is the newest one.
We were talking about the cover. I love the cover of The Assassin of Venice.
Yes, thank you. I can't take credit for it because I had nothing to do with it. The wonderful art team at Crooked Lane did, but I love that she's looking at you. And like, there's this trend in historical fiction covers of, you know, like the woman walking away, like the woman looking away. And like, no shade, because I have that and they're beautiful covers, but Valentina would not turn her back on you because she doesn't trust you. So it's fitting that she is looking right at you from the cover of the book. I love
Nor
it.
should you turn your back on her.
Nor should you turn your back on her, but people underestimate her because she's a woman, and so that
Of course.
usually doesn't go well for them.
Well, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
And your
Wonderful.
incredible, successful career.
Thank you so much.
It's been fun having you come back again and again. And
Yes, it's been wonderful. Thank you again for having me. Thank you all for coming. There's books for sale. I have bookmarks here. I'm happy to sign copies, of course. There's wine, there's food. Please enjoy. And thank you again.
thank you.